This program is made possible by H. David Faust Leadership Fund.
Greetings, Chautauqua. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. My name is Soni Toneme, and I serve Chautauqua as Director of Literary Arts. Today is our last CLSC presentation for this 2020 Summer Assembly season. What a historic summer it has been. I mean, everything we were able to hold conversation with some of the brightest minds on topics ranging from history, climate disruption, gender, education, race, and you name it. And through it all, you have been here as a faithful and engaging audience. For that, on behalf of the CLC and the Chautauqua Institution, I want to thank you. This week, we have been engaging in conversation around the theme, the future we want, the world we need, collective action for tomorrow's challenges. Today's presentation will center around refugees, and who better to discuss refugees than the person who wrote the book titled The Refugees, Viet Nguyen. Viet is joining us this afternoon as the editor of our CLSC selection for this week, The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives. As the title suggests, these are writings by people who were once refugees in their lives. It is a collection of essays, autobiographical essays, that focus more on the human aspect of the subject than the policies around it. We are so glad to have Viet joining us today. Before we start our event, I want to invite the audience to submit their questions for the live Q&A session we are going to have with Viet at the end of our conversation in this presentation using the submission portal chqquestions@chu.org or on Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2020. Now, I would like to introduce Viet. Viet is joining us today from Los Angeles, California, where he is the Errol Arnold Professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He was born in Vietnam and raised in the United States. He is the author of The Sympathizer, which won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize and many other awards. He is also the author of The Refugees and the highly anticipated The Committed, and one children's book, Chicken of the Sea, and two nonfiction books, Race and Resistance, and I forgot the other one, The Lord Never Died. He is going to remind us of the title later. And he is the editor of this week's CLSC selection, The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugees' Life. Please, Chautauqua, join me in welcoming Viet Nguyen. Hello, Viet. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Sonny?
Good. I'm sorry I couldn't remember the other nonfiction book. Can you remind us of the title right now?
No problem. Sometimes I forget too. The other nonfiction book is Nothing Ever Dies.
Nothing Ever Dies.
And the Memory of War.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. And after your presentation, we will come for the conversation, one-on-one conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here and to join your virtual audience. I am coming to you from my basement, and it's been an interesting time during COVID. I'm really impressed that Sony got dressed up for this event. Psychologically, it's a little bit difficult for me to get dressed up to go into my basement, but here I am. And I am just delighted to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives. And the origins of this book came not from me, but from the editor at Abrams Books, Jameson Stoltz, who during the period of the Muslim ban a few years ago was protesting the Muslim ban and realized that his own wife was a refugee. But it was an issue that had never really come up between the two of them. And so Jameson felt that it would be important to do a collection of refugee writers talking about their experiences in this time of high xenophobia against immigrants and refugees. And so he brought the project to me, and of course I accepted because I am a refugee. Now, it might be weird for me to call myself a refugee in the present tense, because as you might be able to see, judging from my basement library, I have long ago made the transition from refugee to bourgeoisie, from camps to clubs. I have been invited to many, many kinds of clubs ever since a sympathizer that I never knew even existed. So it's a very interesting experience for someone of a refugee background to be in the situation that I am today, where it would be very tempting for me not to call myself a refugee. But I call myself a refugee because my earliest memories come from the refugee experience. I was born in Vietnam during the Vietnam War and fled with my family in 1975 when Saigon fell and we found ourselves to be on the losing side. And we, along with 130,000 other South Vietnamese refugees, came to the United States and were put into one of 4 refugee camps. Ours happened to be Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And this is where my memories begin. Because in order to leave one of these camps, Vietnamese refugees needed to have an American to sponsor them. And in the case of our family, no one was willing to take all 4 of us. So, one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And my earliest memories were of being taken away from my parents as I was howling and screaming. Now, I was being taken away for very good reason, to give my parents the time to get on their own 2 feet. But 4-year-old me did not understand that. I experienced it as abandonment and loss. And that experience, while I've tried to forget it, has been unforgettable for me. It's remained stamped between my shoulder blades as an invisible brand. And around the time of the Muslim ban a few years ago, my own son turned 4 years old. And that was the occasion for me to start thinking about what had happened to me at 4, and also as a parent, to understand what had happened to my parents. As a father, I would find it unbearable to have my child taken away from me for any reason. And so I could just imagine and empathize with my own parents in their situation. That's why over the last few years, as we've witnessed what's been happening on our southern border with children being separated from their parents, families being separated, and children being detained in camps, I know that that experience will be unforgettable for those families, for those parents, and especially those children. They will be forever traumatized and scarred by what has happened to them. In my case, I happen to be rather fortunate because I was able to come home after a few months. My brother, who was 10 years old, didn't get to come home for 2 years. And this, he likes to tell me, is how we know Mom and Dad love you more. But you shouldn't feel too bad for him. He came as a refugee who spoke no English at 10 years of age, and 7 years later he graduated as valedictorian of his high school and went on to Harvard. An experience that I will never forget since Harvard rejected me. So I've been talking about the refugee experience as something that is deeply traumatic, and it is, but it's not all bad, because being a refugee has given me the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. And that emotional damage is something I like to pass on to my son. He, like many other kids, loves Legos. But you as a parent know that you cannot give your child everything they ask for. And he's always asking for Legos. And sometimes I have to tell him, no, you can't have those Legos. And I ask him, do you know why you can't have those Legos? And he'll think about it for a while. And this was when he was 4 or 5. And he would say, because you're a refugee? That is right, I would say, because I am a refugee. And it's never too early to teach your children the lessons of empathy. I take that very seriously. My son is now in the second grade. This very morning, online, one of his classmates brought up Black Lives Matter. And then the second grade class proceeded to have a discussion about Black Lives Matter, about racism, about George Floyd, with the teacher using words like injustice, difference, inequality. Our children should be exposed to some of these things, because if we don't expose them to these things, they're going to hear about it from other people in much more negative ways. So when I started talking to my son about refugees, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees said that at this time, just a few years ago, that there were about 66 million displaced people in the world. And of those 66 million, the UNHCR officially classified 22 million of them as refugees. Refugees being people who are forced to move from one country to another. But in the space of just a few years, 66 million displaced people have grown to 79.5 million displaced people. 22 million refugees have grown to 26 million refugees. So we are faced with a significant crisis concerning displaced people and refugees. And this concept of refugees is something that I think a lot of people have not spent time thinking about, especially the distinction between refugees and immigrants. Now, in the European context, refugees and immigrants means one thing. In the American context, something a little bit different. I want to talk about this American context. A couple of years ago, I went to give a talk at a school in Boise, high school, with a program that was devoted specifically to refugee students who came from all the hot spots you can imagine in this world. So I thought I would start off with an easy question, and I asked them, how many of you are refugees? And almost none of these actual refugee students raised their hands. So then I asked them, how many of you are immigrants? And then they began to raise their hands. So even after just a few months or a couple of years in this country, these refugee students knew intuitively that there was something wrong with calling themselves refugees, that there is a stigma attached to refugees. And I can tell you this from personal experience. There's no quicker way to kill a cocktail party conversation than to say, hi, I'm a refugee. Because most Americans have no idea what that means and how to respond to that. I'll give you another example. Some of these Vietnamese people who came as refugees to the United States in 1975 ended up in Louisiana. And about 15 years later, Hurricane Katrina happened. And tens of thousands of people were displaced. And some of the American media who were covering this tragedy called these displaced people refugees. And George Bush, the president, responded by saying, it is un-American to call these people refugees. Now, a lot of them also happen to be African Americans. And for perhaps the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with George Bush and said that it is racist to call black people refugees. And I thought, great. We refugees have succeeded in bringing America together in hating us. So this is the difference between refugees and immigrants for Americans. Even though we are living in a highly xenophobic moment at this time, the immigrant is still a part of American mythology, of the American dream, of the American story that some of us like to tell ourselves about how immigrants make this country great. Refugees are not a part of this narrative. And the only way that many Americans can make sense out of them is to think of refugees as a subset of immigrants. But they're categorically quite different. Because I think refugees come and they are perceived by Americans, but also by people in other host countries, as a threat. Obviously, they're perceived as an economic threat and as a cultural threat, but oftentimes also as a threat to our health, that they are perceived as bringing all kinds of vices and diseases. But they also come bringing with them a very troubling reminder that we are not as safe as we like to think. Americans cannot believe that they can become refugees. That is why George Bush said it's un-American to call Americans refugees. There is something fundamentally incompatible between the American mythology of the American dream and the existence of refugees. Americans cannot believe that this could ever be a country that could produce refugees, despite a considerable degree of evidence that we have been, in fact, a country. From Katrina to Puerto Rico, various natural disasters that have indeed displaced people and turned them into de facto refugees. So refugees have a claim on our guilt, on our fear, and also on many other less positive kinds of emotions. My family came as refugees, and they became immigrants. They started to do what you're supposed to do to succeed in the American dream. They opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California in 1978. And just a few years later, as I was walking down the street, I saw a sign in another store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." So, it was impressed on me at an early age that we were perhaps not wanted in this country. And in fact, in 1975, the majority of Americans did not want to accept refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It was only through an act of Congress and the president that we were allowed in. But many Americans still saw us as a threat because we simply were the newest manifestation of an old yellow peril for this country. And if Vietnamese Americans have succeeded in transforming themselves in the eyes of the American public and themselves into good refugees, it's taken place partly because there have been new refugees coming to this country that we can now point our finger at and describe as the new peril threatening this country. So, for me, it's not enough simply as a former Vietnamese refugee to claim that this country should welcome me and mine and people like me. It's much more important for me to say, I am a refugee, I was a refugee, and it's crucial for people like me to stand up and to identify ourselves in order to help and advocate for the new refugees that are at our borders. And in order to do so, it's critical to tell stories, as I am telling you a story about us, about who we are, and about these new refugees, because stories fulfill something very crucial that statistics cannot. Now, it's absolutely important that we know the statistics. 79.5 million displaced people and 26 million refugees. But these are vast numbers. We still need to understand people as individuals and as human beings. It's a natural human impulse to want to have a story, to want to have a narrative in order to understand someone else's humanity and to empathize with them. And this puts us as writers in a very tricky situation. Because on the one hand, we as writers are all engaged with what John Updike said that writers do, which is to bring the human news to readers. But people of a majority and people who are citizens can take it for granted that everyone will know and accept their humanity. People who are refugees, who are minorities, who have been stigmatized or oppressed in various ways are oftentimes put in the position of having to explain that they are human beings. This is something that no one should be required to explain to anybody. And that's a tricky situation the writers in The Displaced find themselves in, because they must begin from the assumption that they and theirs are already human. And yet they must speak sometimes to audiences who do not understand that fact. So this is the crucial work that stories do, to continue to reaffirm what shouldn't need to be affirmed, our basic humanity. Now, I am a Vietnamese refugee who is proud to be a Vietnamese refugee and who never backs down from being a Vietnamese refugee advocating for other refugees. But there are some of my fellow Vietnamese American refugees who do not take my position. For example, just in the news from yesterday, the new head of Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the United States is a former Vietnamese refugee, Tony Pham. And part of the rhetoric around his appointment that he himself adopts is that he is a good refugee who took the lawful path to citizenship and because of his experiences is an ideal director of ICE. There are probably a lot of Vietnamese Americans who are proud of this Vietnamese American achievement. I am not one of them, because this appointment and the rhetoric around it fits into the narrative of good and bad refugees. It is a narrative that we should reject. What does it do? The narrative of good and bad refugees says that there are some good refugees we should take in because they will become good neighbors, good citizens, good workers, and so on. And that there are some bad refugees that we shouldn't take in because they are a threat to this country. And there are a lot of former Vietnamese American refugees who say we are the good refugees, and these new people, brown people from south of the border, Muslims, and so on, are the bad refugees. We shouldn't let them in. Well, I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community of San Jose, California, of the 1970s and 1980s, and let me tell you something. There were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees. Cash under the table economies, welfare fraud, insurance scams. We did it all. We were so bad we invented a crime that the San Jose Police Department had to come up with a new term for: the home invasion. All of that has been forgotten under the narrative of the good refugees that we supposedly have become. And I just want to say that we were not and are not the good refugees. We were the lucky refugees because we came at a time when it was important for the United States to accept anti-communist refugees fleeing from a communist country in order for the United States to score political points. And we were coming at a time when we were not black. There were Haitian refugees trying to get into this country at the same time. The United States was not so generous in accepting them as they were in accepting Southeast Asian refugees. In my case, and in my family's case, we fit the mold of the good refugees. I won the Pulitzer Prize. Who wouldn't want me to come to their country? But I reject this narrative of the good refugee because as applied to refugee and immigration policy, elevating the good refugee or the good immigrant is actually very pernicious. Because what it really means is that we only want to accept the exceptional refugees and immigrants. And if this country only accepted people like me, this country wouldn't accept very many refugees or immigrants at all. And that, I think, is actually the point of the narrative behind good refugees. We shouldn't be accepting refugees because they are good, and we shouldn't be rejecting refugees because they are bad. We should be building a refugee policy and an attitude towards refugees that stems from an acceptance that they are human. If we begin from the premise that refugees are less than human, are dangerous, and are a threat, we have the refugee policy that we have today in the United States, in which our policy is based on criminalization and punishment and demonization and imprisonment. I think our refugee policy should be based on accepting the notion that the people who want to come into this country are human and that they want what everybody else wants, which is the opportunity for equality. I'm someone who believes that this country is based on equality and the right for equality, and that the refugees who come to this country should have the right to be mediocre just like every other American. That's the country that I stand for. So, we're going to get into many of these issues in much more detail in our conversation. I just want to point out that the book, The Displaced, features 19 writers from 15 different countries talking about a variety of refugee situations and histories. And I just want to point out 3 of them and the different things that they do. At the end of the book, you'll find an essay by Cao Kalia Yang, who is a Hmong refugee from Laos. And in her essay, she describes what it was like to be a Hmong refugee in a Thai refugee camp, where the children in these camps are forced to grow up. They don't have the luxury of longing for Legos. They had to try to find food for their families, and they took it upon themselves to find that food at all costs. And her essay describes the consequences of that in heartbreaking fashion. Then there's Reina Grande's essay about being an undocumented migrant who came to this country from Mexico. I was desperate to include someone like Reina in this book, someone who is not officially classified as a refugee. Because what her essay demonstrates is that the classification of people as refugees is oftentimes highly political. What distinguishes a political refugee from an undocumented migrant? Oftentimes, it's the interests of American domestic and foreign policy. The United States does not want to call brown people coming from south of the border into this country refugees, because it would obligate the United States to do something for them and obligate Americans to think about why people from Mexico and other countries south of our border are coming here. Perhaps our own policies that have meddled with Latin American countries, and our drug consumption habits that have created a drug war in Mexico and other countries, and our creation of gang members in this country that we've exported back to Latin American countries where they further serve to unsettle the situation there and threaten people who need to flee for their lives. We're all responsible for that, but we don't want to call undocumented migrants refugees. And in Reina Grande's essay, she makes it very clear that that is in fact what she is. Someone forced to flee and be separate from her family and to grow up without the privileges of having her parents with her. The last essay is from Dina Nayeri, who wrote an essay about the ungrateful refugee. And she points out something very crucial, which is that host countries expect their refugees to be grateful. And she finds this to be problematic. Now, of course, people should be grateful for being helped. But she points out that the expectation of gratitude that host societies impose upon refugees is oftentimes a form of punishment, a demand that the refugee erase their own history and totally assimilate, and that the refugee forget their histories in order to forget, again, how host countries oftentimes have a relationship to disrupting the very countries that will produce refugees that the host country feels very ambivalent about accepting. These essays are not only essays that humanize refugees and that bring us the human news and their stories. They're also essays that challenge us to question our assumptions about our status if we happen to be citizens and members of host countries, or question our assumptions about who we are, our responsibilities, and who these refugees are that we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viet. This was wonderful, beautiful, beautiful, and thank you for this collection as well. Those personal stories were so important for us to know. Those are people with, like you said, mediocre lives, sometimes with banal problems, like everyone else. And I want to muddy the idea of the good refugee a little bit more, because I've been called a good immigrant, countersign, and like you, I refuse this qualification because I think it's harmful on me, because it's asking me too much, and also undermining the ones who are immigrants who are not able to be, say, director of literary art here, and they work as hard as I do, but different circumstances. But also to two group of people, I think. When we talk about good immigrants or good refugees, we are seeing people who are finally able to become Americans. And to be Americans, to be seen as American here is to be seen other than Black and Native Americans. So these are their attribution for being an American here. And I am wondering if refugees like you won the prize, you're a big shot. Your brother is a big shot doctor, and if we were to see these people as the good refugees and as the prototypes for us to follow, how is this harming other refugees and other Americans who are marginalized? And I wanted to see how you can talk about that and how this type of complacency is not only something that we can blame on refugees, but and also we cannot blame on the hosts. But it's a really structural things that we need to work on.
I think it's a great question, because at this moment, as I've mentioned already, we're in a very xenophobic stage of our society against immigrants, which is actually not new. This country goes through cycles of attitudes towards immigrants, and we have been deeply xenophobic towards immigrants in the past. So in this moment of xenophobia, for those of us who believe in immigrants, it's really crucial, obviously, to stand up for immigrants and say, I support immigrants, I support refugees. It is a good thing that this country is taking in these populations. And so we feel the need to defend immigrants and refugees for very good reason. Now, that being said, it should also be acknowledged, as you're implying, that immigrants and refugees coming into this country, fulfilling the narrative of immigration as being a part of American success, help to affirm this American dream narrative. We're the greatest country in the world. Of course, people will want to come here. This makes Americans feel good about themselves. Even if you're a xenophobic American, you still understand the idea that this country is so great, people want to come here. But the problem with this narrative, of course, is that it also serves as an alibi to distract our attention from the fact that the United States, besides being a country of immigrants, is also a colonizing country, a country whose very existence is based on conquest, on genocide, on slavery. These are very uncomfortable facts that Americans don't want to deal with and would rather not talk about. And so instead, our attention is displaced onto the controversial but much more palatable figure of the immigrant. And a lot of immigrants and refugees, as you suggest, totally participate in this narrative. They say, yes, of course, we should be a country of immigrants and refugees. But as you say, when you are an immigrant or a refugee and you come here, you are automatically already at an advantage, no matter how difficult your situation, because you are not Black for a lot of immigrants and refugees, and you are not Native. So you've already escaped from two of the most pernicious forms of racism in our society. And it doesn't take long for an immigrant or a refugee to learn that one of the quickest ways to become accepted as an American is to participate in American racism against Black people and against Native people, either explicitly or by simply accepting the dominant attitudes of our society. Now, if you happen to be an immigrant who is Black from the Caribbean or from Africa, for example, you're in sort of an ambiguous situation for a moment, because you're coming in as an immigrant with immigrant attitudes, but your children are going to be African American, are going to be Black, and they will not be able to escape from these underlying fundamental problems of this country. So that's why I think it's really crucial for immigrants and refugees such as myself to not only talk about our immigrant or refugee experience, but to connect what we have been through and what we are undergoing to other elements and aspects of American society, including these issues of anti-Black racism, anti-Native racism.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to remind our audience that you can submit your questions for the live Q&A with Viet and Nguyen through the submission portal at questions.chu.org or on Twitter using the hashtag CHU2020. The next I would talk a little bit about is more to do with the future. And you touched about it a little bit with Hurricane Katrina, and how Americans were affected, and we were unable really to accept those people as refugees because we have already a standard definition for refugees. And I'm thinking about the future, especially the near future, when climate disruption and food shortage will be dire, and some people in the United States will have to move, and they will have to move en masse. So how are we going to be able to adjust our definition of refugees to include those people? And if we are not in danger when I say if here, we're talking about Americans, if Americans are not in danger of being also refugees and being treated as refugees there. And I don't know if you want to talk about that, or if you've seen something similar happen in some already.
Yes, and I think that's exactly why UNHCR has these different kinds of classifications. Under the category of displaced persons, there's a category for internally displaced people. These are people who are forced to relocate within the boundaries of a country. And certainly that would be what we saw with Hurricane Katrina and in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And there's no reason to believe that these things won't happen again in this country. I mean, the predictions are fairly obvious that climate catastrophe will do things like raise the level of the ocean so that a great degree of the coastal United States is going to be underwater. A lot of people will have to leave these parts of the country. Millions of people, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage. So what are we supposed to do? One aspect of confronting refugees is this idea that we should just be building walls. That is our policy right now on the southern border. We just need to build a big enough wall to keep people out. That is probably a policy that is not going to work in the long run. As we've been seeing, people will climb over walls, will go under walls, will go around walls, especially if they happen to be desperate enough and if there are enough of them. And then the second issue is we can't or shouldn't probably build walls within our own country. Although, even as I say it, I think, well, we actually have built walls around gated enclaves and so on. But building walls is not going to solve that problem. What will try to solve the problem would be a fundamental shift in our notions of empathy and in our understanding of our connection to other populations. Why do we think that it's okay to build walls against people from another country, but that it's probably not okay to build walls within our own country? It's because we've developed a certain sense of empathy that allows us to think that people we call Americans, who we have never met before, and we have not met 99.99% of Americans, those people are still our neighbors, and we should be taking care of them. That's ideally what we should be doing as members of a country. Why is that sense of empathy not extended to the rest of the world? I think about how a few thousand years ago, our sense of empathy was nowhere near as developed. We were only responsible for the people in our village, and then our city-state, and then finally our nation. So we've had a history in the last several thousand years of expanding our notions of empathy and community to include ever more people. And that's the next challenge if we want to survive climate catastrophe, is to make sure that our notion of humanity or our notion of empathy embraces all of humanity, because climate catastrophe is a global problem, not a local problem. And this is why the specter of refugees, I think, is terrifying, because there is no singular solution for most refugee crises or problems, whatever you want to call them. There isn't a single action that we can take that will prevent refugees from coming, especially if we think that the issues of climate catastrophe, the disruptions of water supplies, the destruction of food supplies are the consequences of our entire industrial and post-industrial societies and our habits of consumption. So we need to be able to actually change fundamentally how we live within this country in order to try and avoid having to confront a globally disrupted society. We would rather not think about that, which is why, again, we'd rather build walls as we confront refugees rather than thinking about structural changes in our lives, our psyches, and our habits. I think that's the challenge that refugees pose. Like most other problems that we face in this country, refugees are not isolated from other kinds of social conditions. Refugees can't be isolated from our habits of capitalist consumption or our drug consuming habits or how we enact our foreign policy, just as the issue of police violence and the killing of black people in this country can't be disentangled from this entire history of colonization and conquest that has led to the country that we are today.
That's true. Thank you. I love the essays. I love all of them, and I think they resonate with me more because they are so personal, and or they are autobiographical or sometimes reportage in someone's life, really, really personal, and I find it very important. But at the same time, I'm wondering what can someone like me do next, beside changing my position on how I understand the idea of refugees and immigrants, and how my action can influence policies, which was something that the essays did not really touch very much on. But what can we do beside changing our own stance on the way we see or we understand, we say, and trying to be empathetic? What kind of very good action, as the theme said, collective action that we can take for tomorrow to address those issues?
Writers are very good at telling stories and exhorting people, maybe not so good at writing policy solutions, right? Well, I think at the level of policy, there's a whole different set of things we can talk about. But at the level of individual action, I think for me, there's a variety of things that people can do. I mean, obviously, there's this idea that you could join organizations that actually work for and advocate for refugees. A lot of people simply don't have the time to do that. Well, you could also donate money to the various organizations that advocate and work for refugees. UNHCR is a good starting point for that. They do a lot of incredible work. So does, now of course the name of the organization is slipping my mind. Someone in the chat window probably knows, but Albert Einstein started it. It started to advocate for Jewish refugees, continues to advocate for refugees worldwide. International Rescue Committee, that's the name. And then there's many other smaller regional, national, local organizations that help refugees within your city or in the country that you're interested in particular. And then I think the third component is, as always, education and self-education. That's partly the function that these writers and myself serve, to continue to challenge readers to think about who they are in relationship to refugees. I think it's crucial in this idea of education and self-education not to pity refugees. Nobody wants pity. And I speak about this from the perspective of having been a Vietnamese refugee and seen a lot of discourse around Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian refugees. Western media called Vietnamese refugees boat people, and most of the world knows boat people from these images of terribly suffering people on boats and islands and drownings and all these horrible, terrible things. And I would say most refugees don't want to be associated with these kinds of images and with the objectification that comes from them, thinking of them as victims who need pity. Think of people as human beings to whom we owe our compassion, and people in whose places we might one day occupy. That's much more productive than pity, because hopefully it will get us, again, at the level of education and self-education, to start to think about how we are implicated in the production of refugees. Vietnamese refugees would not be in this country if the United States had not been in Vietnam. That's a hard reality for people to confront. And so, again, instead of objectifying refugees and thinking of them only as people who need help, although they certainly do, we need to think about how our own habits, our own complicities make us involved in a global world, a global history that has disruptions outside of our visibility, beyond our horizons, that produces refugees that then come into our consciousness as threatening or pitiful figures. That's not the position that we should be adopting.
Thank you so much, Viet. And now we're going to make time for the Q&A with the audience. We have received some questions, and I'm going to read the question verbatim to you. The first one, I think, really speaks to what you're talking about being a writer here. That can you speak to the power of writing in literature to illustrate and illuminate humanness and humanity?
Well, I think that's what literature does from the very beginning. That's this very premise. I mean, if literature that is not about human beings wouldn't be very interesting. But I think what's crucial to address here is what is our notion of humanity? What do we expect a story to tell us? And especially when it comes to stories that are talking about people we don't know. Okay, that's different from stories talking about people we do know. Okay. Let's say that many of you who are on this call, not all of you, but many of you, are white people. You pick up a novel by your fellow white person, Jonathan Franzen. And you begin with the assumption that you and Jonathan Franzen are in the same world. You might be from Massachusetts or from California or from Texas, and Jonathan Franzen is from St. Louis. But when Jonathan Franzen says in a novel, "I ate a sandwich," you know exactly what he's talking about. Or when Jonathan Franzen describes the middle-aged disasters and sex lives of people from the Midwest, you know exactly what he's talking about. And I do too. I grew up in this country. I grew up watching the stories and reading the stories of white people. I know white people pretty well. So I know when I read stories about and from white people in this country that what I am getting is a slice of life that doesn't have to say everything there is to need to know, that we need to know about white people. You don't have that obligation as a white author. You just got to tell your story about growing up white in St. Louis. And you know that you can talk about your middle-aged parents and their sexual disasters and not have people assume that this is somehow representative of every single white person in the world. And that sexual dysfunction for white people is not a commentary about white people. It's just a commentary about this one particular family. Okay? So, when refugees or minorities or people of color, people who are basically not white and not part of the dominant class, which means their stories are not being told all the time, deliver their stories, approach them as human stories that are not obligated to tell you, the reader, whether you happen to be white or not white, just a reader who's not of the same background as the author or the background of the people in the story. Do not approach the story as an ethnography about a population. Approach it as a story about people, as individuals. And this obligation falls upon the writers as well. I know a lot of writers, or I've seen a lot of writings by people who are refugees or minorities or immigrants or whatever, marginalized populations, where the writer sometimes feels obligated to be a representative of the entire population. Big mistake. Or the writer feels that they can only tell one aspect of the story, which is the good aspect of the story. They want to tell the good version of the refugee experience, for example, because they don't want their readers to think that if they told a bad story, that readers would somehow judge these refugees based on the bad story. That is a huge mistake for any writer to make. Our obligation as writers is, if we deliver the human news, to deliver all of it, the good and the bad, because all of us are good and bad. And this is, again, this goes back to the point of thinking about refugees as victims or pitying them. When you do that, you're not making them more human. You're stripping them of their humanity by saying they're only this one dimension. Like I said, I knew a lot of refugees in San Jose, California. They were wonderful people, and sometimes these wonderful people did terrible things, like drink too much, commit adultery, beat their kids. This is a part of humanity. When we say humanity, we also mean inhumanity. All of us are capable of human and inhuman behavior as individuals and as populations. Literature, good literature, confronts that complexity, whether that literature is being written by and for, or by or about the dominant class in a society, or by and about the refugees and the immigrants and the minorities.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. And I wanted to read one line from the collection. It's by Alexander Herman and the essay God's Faith. And he wrote, "What literature does, or at least can do, is allow for individual narrative enfranchisement." And I think that talks to what you were, your answer there. The next question we have is, can you speak to the connection between the essay collection, the Displaced, and your short story collection, The Refugees, if there are any?
Yes, absolutely. I grew up in this Vietnamese refugee community of San Jose in the 1970s and 1980s, but I felt myself to be an American. I was fluent in English. I grew up reading, English language books, watching English language movies, and being fully exposed to American culture. And what was obvious to me at a certain point in my adolescence was that I knew a lot about Americans, but Americans knew almost nothing about Vietnamese people. And what they did know about Vietnamese people was communicated almost purely through television images of the Vietnam War and through Hollywood movies about the Vietnam War in the 1970s and 1980s that fought the war all over again. And I saw almost every one of those Hollywood movies about the Vietnam War, and it's an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese, okay? Because our only function in the American imagination is to be victims or to be Viet Cong. That's it. That's a very difficult self-image for a young refugee to grow up with. And so I thought, and I loved reading books. My escape from the traumatic life of being a refugee and all the difficulties that I saw with my parents and their struggle to survive and what was happening in the Vietnamese refugee community, my way of escape was through the library and through reading books. And so literature was the first love of my life, and I thought at a very young age I want to become a writer. And at a young age, I didn't think that I wanted to write about Vietnamese people. My first book in the third grade was about Lester the cat, okay? A cat stricken with urban ennui who runs off to the countryside to find romantic love with a country cat. So that was the kind of story that I wanted to write when I was young. It was only when I got to college and I got a fuller understanding of history and the United States and warfare and inequality and injustice that I thought, it's actually really crucial for me to be a writer who can tell stories about people whose stories are not being told. In my case, Vietnamese refugees. And that was the genesis for writing The Refugees. I won that prize for Lester the Cat in the third grade. I thought, cool, I won a prize. I can become a writer. And that set me off on the road to 30 years of misery of trying to become a writer. And the Refugees took 17 years of those 30 years. A really horrible, miserable experience writing this collection. Hopefully you don't feel that way when you're reading it. Hopefully, they go down as easily as potato chips. That was the comparison someone made to me once. Eating short stories is like eating potato chips. It's got to eat a few at a time. That's perfect. So the stories are based on this idea that it was necessary to tell the stories of Vietnamese people because at the time that I started writing this book, there weren't that many books by Vietnamese American writers out there. So it took me 17 years to write the book, and during the 17 years, a lot of Vietnamese American writers published their books. So I was kind of late to the scene, but I got it out of my system to tell these human stories about Vietnamese people in all their complexities. And after I got finished with that, I thought, I have paid my debt to American society and to Vietnamese refugees. I no longer need to tell the stories of my people. And so then I wrote The Sympathizer, which is a completely different book with a very completely different character.
Thank you. Thank you. I would love to have another conversation with you to talk about movies, American movies, the Vietnam War, especially the last one with Spike Lee. I think Spike Lee directed it, the Five Blood, which is disappointing. But we have to move on to the next question, and this one is, I think this was asked during the time when you were talking about the different distinction for refugees, like the UN has put out, and it's all these distinctions for displaced persons, possibly part of the challenge we face for our political failures to recognize refugees as humans?
Well, first of all, on The Five Bloods, you can read my essay in the New York Times. Just Google it, Viet, Nguyen, New York Times, The Five Bloods. You'll get my opinion on The Five Bloods. And just to make a note of it, like just a couple of days ago, a major magazine editor asked me, "Do you want to interview Spike Lee?" And I said, "Do you know that I wrote this essay about The Five Bloods? I'd be perfectly happy to interview Spike Lee, but maybe you should send his team the essay and see whether he wants to be interviewed by me." So we'll see. My hopes are not high. But to the question of classification, yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. I mean, obviously we need classification and categories to make sense of the world, and bureaucracies like the United Nations needs these classifications and categories, but they're highly politicized, as I mentioned, and subjected to the contestations and manipulations of the various powers that be. I'll point to one example, that related to refugees, which is that in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, obviously Cambodia was deeply destabilized, and Khmer Rouge came to power, killed a whole lot of people, and that is not officially that is not categorized as a genocide by the United Nations, according to the terminology, the legal classification of terminology. It looks like a genocide, but it is not a genocide for most of the people who died in Cambodia, because a genocide is supposed to be when one population kills or harms people of another population. And so if it's Cambodians killing Cambodians, that's not a genocide. It's only when Cambodians were killing ethnic minorities that it was a genocide. This, to me, is ludicrous. And likewise, when we get to the classification of whether someone is a displaced person, a refugee, an internally displaced person, or an asylum seeker, I think these are the classifications that UNHCR uses. Yeah, we're getting into important nuances of different kinds of experiences, but I also think that we are missing out on what it is that, again, what stories can do that bureaucrats and lawyers can't do, which is to bring the urgency of people's experiences. Technically, it may matter whether you're an asylum seeker or a refugee, but in either situation, you're someone in dire need, being driven by circumstances usually beyond your control. And we should be responding to people at that level, not just at the level of whether they are an asylum seeker or a refugee. And when we get into these classifications with undocumented migrants, what it leads to is a bureaucracy that is using these classifications to accept or reject people. And usually it's to reject people once you have these classifications in place. Bureaucrats, agents at the border are trying to find.
Okay. Thank you so much, Viet. The time is running out for us, and there's a storm happening here in the studio. And someone asked, and I think you can take a minute before the end of it to. The person noticed your new book, The Committed, a picture of it, and they asked if you wouldn't mind talk a little bit about it in 1 minute about the book a little bit.
Well, thank you to this questioner in particular. Right. So I wrote a novel called The Sympathizer, and it published in 2015 about a Vietnamese communist spy who is, who's spying on the South Vietnamese army, and then in 1975, when South Vietnam collapses, he's tasked with a mission of fleeing to the United States with the remnants of that army to spy on them. So it's a spy novel, action novel, political novel, and so on. Well, he lives at the end of the book, and I thought, I need to write a sequel about this, and that is The Committed. I will say that I wrote The Sympathizer to offend everybody, and it worked. I get hate mail from all different kinds of populations, but I did not write The Sympathizer really to offend the French. The Committed is set in Paris of the early 1980s, and it is designed to offend the French. So for those Americans out there who are offended by my satire of the United States and The Sympathizer, go read The Committed and participate in some hating on the French in that book.
Well, I cannot wait. I cannot wait to read it. I'm from Haiti, and we love making fun of the French in Haiti. So I welcome that. Thank you so much, Viet. It was so fun talking with you and so insightful, all things you were to share with us. And thank you so much for this collection. And thank you to all the participants in this collection. And thank you to our audience. It has been a great summer assembly season. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to our production team. Thank you to Chautauqua. Thank you for making this possible. And Viet, thank you. I'll see you in 2 minutes.
Thanks,
but
Tony.
now,
Thanks.
bye-bye.
Thanks to the entire audience. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.